Have you ever looked at your own child and realized that to them, you are no longer a person, but a logistical problem to be solved? It's a terrifying transformation, the transition from being the one who gave them life to being the one who is taking up space in theirs. Did you know that the most devastating betrayals don't happen in a courtroom, but in the quiet okay whispered between a husband and wife in a hallway while they think you're asleep? My name is Callie Hoffman. At 65, I was discarded like a piece of broken furniture. But my husband Hector was an architect who knew that sometimes the only way to save a structure is to let the rot fall away. This is the story of how I lost everything, slept in my car in the dead of winter, and found out I owned more than I ever dared to dream. The end didn't arrive with a scream. It arrived with the smell of burnt toast. I was standing in the kitchen of the West Vancouver estate, a house filled with the ghosts of 40 years of marriage, carefully spreading butter on 2 slices of rye. I did it slowly, the way my joints required now, savoring the small ritual of a morning I thought belonged to me. Then, Tatum, my daughter-in-law, walked in. She didn't say good morning. She didn't ask how I slept. She simply wrinkled her nose as if something had crawled into the vents and died. "Again," she said. The word was sharp, like a January wind whipping off the Pacific. "I'm sorry, Tatum," I said, turning to face her. "The setting was a bit high. I'll open the window." She didn't move to help. She just leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms, looking at me with that clinical, detached gaze, the way you look at a stained rug that no longer matches the room. "It's not just the toast, Callie," she said, her voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm tone she used when she was about to dissect someone. "It's every morning. The crumbs, the smell, the presence." She waved her hand in a loose circle, dismissing my entire existence in her kitchen. My son, James, was sitting at the table behind her. He had his phone in both hands, his thumbs dancing across the screen. He didn't look up. He didn't defend the woman who had stayed up with him through 1,000 fevers. In that quiet moment, with the smell of burnt bread between us, I realized I was standing in a house that was about to collapse. My husband, Hector Webster, had been a man of blueprints and silence. He was an architect, an engineer of bridges and high-rises, who was careful with numbers and even more careful with words. He loved me with an extravagant, absolute devotion that I took for granted, the way one takes for granted the foundation of a house until the earth starts to shake. When Hector passed away 3 years ago, sitting in his favorite armchair with a book on his lap, the world went grey. The house felt like a museum of a life that had ended. James called 2 weeks later. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone up there," he said. "Move in with us in the city. We'll take care of you." He suggested, very gently, very reasonably, that we sell the family estate rather than let it sit empty. He offered to manage the proceeds until I got settled, because I was grieving and he was my son, and I trusted him with my life. I signed the power of attorney. I know how that sounds. But grief is a fog that narrows your world to the next hour and the next meal. I thought I was watching my son step into the role Hector had always hoped he would fill. The house sold for nearly $2 million. James deposited the money into a joint account for convenience. Within 18 months, I couldn't tell you where a single cent of it had gone. All I knew was that Tatum had redecorated the penthouse twice. James had a new luxury SUV, and whenever I asked about the balance, the answer was always, "The market is volatile, Mom. Don't worry, I'm managing it." I stopped asking. That was my first mistake. The first year in the penthouse was bearable, if lonely. I had a small room overlooking the alleyway, and I paid for my keep by doing the grocery shopping, cooking dinner 4 nights a week, and picking up my grandson, Leo, from school. I didn't mind. I loved Leo, and I told myself that contribution was its own form of belonging. But Tatum had her own ideas about belonging. She worked in marketing, and brought that instinct for total control home with her. The spices had to be alphabetical. The dishwasher had to be loaded in her specific, rigid pattern. The sofa cushions had to be positioned at exact 4-5-degree angles. She never shouted at first. She managed through small, precise corrections that were impossible to object to because they seemed so reasonable. Callie, don't use the good pot for oatmeal. It scratches. Callie, you left the hallway light on again. I tried to adapt. I spent 40 years making a marriage work through negotiation and good faith. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't in a negotiation. I was in a slow erasure. The morning she poured my coffee down the sink because I had brewed it too early and it was sitting, I felt something shift. James was right there. He watched her do it. He just said, "Mom, she has a point. You know how she likes fresh coffee?" Then he left for work. By the following March, Tatum was referring to my room as the guest suite when she spoke to her friends. I was no longer a mother. I was a permanent guest who had overstayed her welcome. The decision was made on a Tuesday, while the city was gripped by a bitter, biting frost. I was in the small storage suite, the room Tatum had repurposed from my bedroom to a home office, sorting through old tax documents. The walls were thin, and the house was quiet, save for the hum of the HVAC system. "She's a liability, James." Tatum's voice cut through the silence, sharp and calculated. "If she trips on the stairs or if she leaves the stove on one more time, it's our insurance premium that goes up. We need the space for the new firm's expansion anyway." I stood perfectly still, my hand hovering over a file folder. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum in my chest. "She has nowhere else to go," James replied. His voice was weary, devoid of the warmth I had once known. It was the sound of a man trying to solve an equation that had become too difficult to balance. "There's a facility in the valley," Tatum countered. "It's state-assisted. It's affordable. We've used the money from her estate to upgrade this place, James. We can't keep subsidizing her existence." "Okay," James said. The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Okay. In that moment, the bridge I had built my life upon the trust I had placed in my own son crumbled. I wasn't a mother to him. I was a line item. I was a structural defect in his perfect, curated life. 2 days later, the conversation happened. James didn't look me in the eye. He handed me a check for $3,000, the remnants of my life's work, and told me I had 48 hours to vacate. "It's for the best, Mum," he whispered, finally catching my gaze for a split second before looking away. "The facility in the valley it's going to be a good change of pace for you." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. The shock had acted like an anesthetic, numbing the pain. I packed my life into 2 suitcases and the trunk of my old sedan. I drove out of the city as the snow began to fall, turning the world into a blur of white and grey.
I spent the first night at a motel that smelled of damp carpet and stale cigarette smoke. By the third night, the $3,000 had been whittled down by motel rates and basic necessities. The affordable facilities were all full, or they required deposits I no longer had. I parked my car at a 24-hour truck stop on the edge of the industrial district. It was a place where the air was thick with diesel fumes and the constant hum of idling engines. I pulled my seat back, wrapped myself in Hector's old, heavy wool coat, and waited for the morning. There is an intimacy to being homeless that no one warns you about. You become intimately acquainted with the way the temperature drops at 3 a.m., the way the metal of the car frame contracts and clicks, and the way you become invisible to everyone walking past your windows. For 11 nights, I lived in that car. My skin went pale, and my fingers grew stiff from the constant chill. I started to understand the true geometry of my situation. The house I had helped build, the son I had raised, and the marriage I had honored were all gone. On the 9th night, I found myself going through the deadweight bag, a canvas satchel I had refused to leave behind. It contained Hector's old drafting tools, a few photos, and an envelope I had forgotten about. It was sealed with red wax, bearing the logo of a law firm I hadn't thought about in 20 years, Miller, Vance & Oae. Inside was a letter, penned in Hector's precise, architectural script. "My dearest Callie," it read, "if you are reading this, the world has shifted, and you are standing on ground that feels like it's giving way. I have spent my life building structures, but I know that the most important structure is the one you build for your own security. I have placed the true foundation of our life in a trust you do not yet know exists. Sandra Oae will know what to do." I didn't understand it then, but the letter contained the keys to a series of properties: the industrial lots, the small apartment complexes, and the residential land Hector had quietly acquired throughout his career, hidden away from the world and, more importantly, from anyone who might try to claim them. The next morning, the air in the city felt different, sharper, clearer. I walked into the offices of Miller, Vance & Oae. I didn't look like a woman who owned millions. I looked like a woman who had been living in her car for 11 days. But when the receptionist asked for my name, I didn't stutter. "Callie Hoffman," I said. "I am here to see Sandra Oae." When Sandra entered the lobby, she didn't look at my clothes. She looked at the folder in my hands. Within an hour, the truth was laid out on a mahogany table. Hector hadn't just been an architect of buildings. He had been an architect of legacy. He had anticipated that James might not inherit his father's integrity. He had spent decades quietly buying land, commercial units, and residential properties under a trust that could only be accessed by me upon the presentation of the letter. "The portfolio, Callie," Sandra said, her voice filled with a quiet respect, "is valued at over $14 million. And your son and his wife, they are currently living in a property owned by the Hoffman Trust." I felt a cold, sharp calm settle over me. For years, I had been the one keeping the peace, the one absorbing the criticism, the one making myself small to make others feel big. "I want you to issue a notice," I said, my voice steady. "They are to pay market-rate rent on their penthouse, retroactive to the date of their last lease renewal, or they are to vacate within 30 days. No more family subsidies." I didn't call James. I let the law firm do it. When he finally called, his voice was thin, the voice of a man who had suddenly realized the ground he was standing on belonged to someone else. "Mom, the lawyers, they're saying this penthouse is part of a trust? How? How is this possible?" "Hector built a foundation, James," I replied, staring out at the city skyline from my new temporary office. "You just never bothered to look at the blueprints." He begged. He talked about family loyalty and how they were just getting started with their new firm. He tried to gaslight me, telling me that I was being cruel and that this wasn't how a family acted. "You're right," I said, my heart feeling like a heavy, solid stone. "This isn't how a family acts." But then again, a son doesn't put his mother in a car in the middle of winter because she's a liability. I didn't yield. For 30 days, I held the line. And for 30 days, James and Tatum realized that their world wasn't held together by their own brilliance, but by the very woman they had discarded. We are often told that our value is tied to how much we give, how much we serve, and how much we endure. But I learned that there is a difference between being a pillar and being a doormat. A pillar holds up the roof. A doormat just gets stepped on. If you are a woman who has spent her life in the quiet work of care, raising children, managing the infrastructure of a family, holding everyone else's world together, know that your work has immense value. If you find yourself at the bottom, know that it is not the end. It is merely the place where you begin to build your own walls, your own roof, and your own foundation. My name is Callie Hoffman. I am 65 years old. My husband left me the instructions to fight, and I did. Please subscribe if you believe in standing up for your worth. The snow is melting, and the ground is ready for something new. We spend our lives creating homes, but we rarely verify who actually holds the title to our own lives. We become so adept at supporting others that we forget to check if we are building on sand or stone. Ask yourself, are you the architect of your own destiny, or are you just a tenant in someone else's plan? Don't wait for the cold to set in to discover if your foundation is solid. Take the time to understand your own rights, your own assets, and your own value. Not just as a mother, a wife, or a daughter, but as an individual. Because when the walls come down, and they eventually will, what you have built for yourself is the only thing that will keep you warm.